siloed view, traffic, monitoring of production traffic being sort of the end all be all of API security. When you really start deconstructing that and just apply some logic to it, what that can tell you is what APIs are being used, what endpoints are being used, what's live, what are you aware of over the interface that you're monitoring, that kind of thing. But it's a little bit akin to standing outside of a kitchen at a restaurant, monitoring the food that goes by and the plates that come back, and being asked, okay, tell me everything that's in the freezer. I can't tell you everything that's in the freezer just looking at traffic. I can't tell you everything that the restaurant has bought. I can tell you what people have ordered. I can tell you what the kitchen has delivered for that point in time. But there's a lot of attack surface that's exposed that people may not be actively interacting with, and those things get missed. And that's why we need multiple lenses actually at the code level in the testing process, and then validating. False positives in API security are notoriously difficult to avoid. And if you think about why that is, if you do static analysis, for example, on the code that's used to publish or expose these APIs, for example, you may not see authentication in that code. That doesn't mean that authentication isn't performed somewhere else in line to the outside world. But if all you do is you look at one lens and then start generating tickets based on that without bringing that context together, then you can drive your devs crazy with false positives, justifiably, because it's not a real issue. But fundamentally, it goes back to the same problem. You don't have enough visibility to really understand your attack surface. Now, if you have that visibility, then you can do things like, okay, let's send a request with valid authentication and an invalid authentication or no authentication. And now if I get a 200 OK with no authentication from the outside, I know that that endpoint is not authenticating properly, right? I mean, you then can get that validation and say, okay, this is a validated issue. Now this is what we need to do about it. But the problem, one big problem that we've seen trying to secure APIs is if you try to piece these little lenses together and act on those things, these lenses are often insufficient on their own. You can't just look at code. You can't just look at traffic. You can't just use a crawler to enumerate. You have to put these things together to give you that context. And then you can get to the actionable intel and actually start allocating resources intelligently and not just spinning off a bunch of devs to go waste their time. That's if you're trying to spin up an API security program and you're only looking at one lens, you're going to wind up with some pretty irritated stakeholders when you start sending them false positives.
Nick, do you want to just quickly talk about the problems of scopes with OAuth and actually validating them, because it's something we do a lot of, and it is hard.
Yeah. OAuth. If I'm calling your API, I'd probably rather you use OAuth than you have rolled your own weird one. that adds more problems. So let me caveat that. But OAuth scopes are very powerful. It often turns into a documentation problem of, okay, what scope do I need to call this API? But doubly so, if there's no documentation telling me so which ones are good and which ones are bad, then we can't check that having the wrong scope will be rejected by the API if you have an access token with the wrong scope. So that is often at least hidden and is often not easily found if you're just trying to call an API. It's often sort of in the English text in the documentation somewhere, or sort of in the sort of collective knowledge of the developers, but not necessarily elsewhere. I think that is the real issue there.
And I think just to echo on that, one of the problems that we do see is the specifications themselves do not sit nicely with security. There is not really a valid security definition within OpenAPI specifications. You can have the OpenID Connect standard, but it's not always implemented or even referenced. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it's hardly ever referenced or implemented for a lot of providers. And it's not having a standard language we can use for actually checking those positions does seem to be a problem, Chuck, I would thought.
Yeah, I agree. It winds up with, if everybody did everything the same way, then we may have people that are vulnerable, broadly to the same issue across a ton of companies. But the alternate version of that, the other side of that coin is that everybody's a unique snowflake. And what they're doing differently or what they're doing wrong is specific to that organization, which is really difficult to understand. What is the desired target state, and how do you make sure that you've actually hit that target state and that you're staying at that target state? Your point about the documentation being a really critical part of understanding what the APIs are designed to do. Unfortunately, we still see a lot of human issue where devs will very readily, in a lot of cases, take an API that was designed, or something that was designed for internal use, and then they'll just remove pieces of documentation and expose the whole thing to the outside world, and basically manufacture blind spots that if you then give that abbreviated or abridged documentation to a security tester, and that's all they base it on, they're going to miss the things that are available. Just because it's not documented doesn't mean it's not open to the outside. And so we've actually seen a number of flawed internal processes that are doing most things correctly, or most things mostly correctly, and then wind up manufacturing a blind spot to the outside world based on, just pull that section of code out. We don't want people doing that. But they didn't actually, section of the documentation out. But they didn't actually change the code. They didn't actually change the contract. They didn't make this stuff unavailable. They just made it undocumented. And that leads to a bad time down the line for your own testing, for pen testing, and then the first time you find out about it is some zealous attacker or penetrator. It's these things come together and have outsized impacts to the end result that a lot of defenders just don't see today. It's a shame.
Making it easier for